So this idea of trying to look at how do we experience the Christ in the etheric in the light of the 20th and the 21st century. And if you've read the program, you will have seen that there's a number of subcategories. And I've got my notes for this lecture. Here they are. I'm going to work through my reminders. And part of the lecture was to try and express the urgency, I suppose, of the Michael age. So, as we know, we're trying to get a chair there. There's a chair. There's a couple of chairs back there as well. Brenda, do you want to come?
I can't walk over.
Okay. I don't know if I'm going to write on the board, so we'll discover that as we go. I might be compelled. So the question, one of the questions that arises as you read Rudolf Steiner is that there's this 19th century that he finds complicated and considers to be the most materialistic in its thinking. And that there's a kind of a battle for the soul of the human being in that century, and that culminates in the 1870s. He names the year 1879, where he says the Archangel Michael takes over regency of guiding humanity for a while. And we are still in that time. But as I've been reading over the sort of last 3 or 4 years, I've discovered that it becomes more and more urgent to understand what has changed for us since 1879. There are many different things that he asks us to consider as to what happens to the human being since 1879, and therefore what we might have to do to be spiritual or do spiritual work in this time. So I'm going to name a few that I think are relevant for tonight. So with the dawning of the Michael age, Mammon was also unleashed upon humanity, a being whose interest is to be counter, it's almost like the shadow of Michael. We also have in that time a number of other things. For example, in his lectures about the fall of the angels of darkness, he says, since anyone who's been born since 1879 has to deal with the fact that before we are born, an angel, a dark angel, sort of enters into us and leaves just before our birth. So we struggle. He says anyone born after 1879 really has different conditions in the world, which we will come to feel a little bit tonight, but also just purely constitutional. Another aspect that we need to take deep into consideration for tonight is that since 1879, or certainly through the 19th century, another crucifixion of the Christ took place. And another, we could call it, he actually calls it the 5th step in the mystery of Golgotha. So what we know is the biblical account is the 4th step. There were 3 mysteries of the Christ and the Jesus being working together. The most physical was 2,000 years ago. But in our time, there's a 5th step where in the etheric world, there is a reappearance of the Christ in the etheric. This has happened since 1879. And the question tonight is, well, how do we do that in the light of the changing conditions? And we will discover tonight that we actually need to broaden some of our horizons in the light of what is the effect of the adversarial forces. We're very used to, in our circles, talking about the dual nature of evil of Lucifer and Ahriman. But as we come into these times, we're going to really have to start learning to find language about the work of a third aspect of evil, known as the Asuras. One could see them as a third force of evil, but we could also see them as the angels of Ahriman, the dark angels, of course. So I want to try and approach that tonight to see we live in this very complex world, but what we tend to do when we open up these questions of the Asuras, and tonight I also want to brings some understanding of what is this sphere that is around us that's known as the eighth sphere. And my experience in myself and in conversations, Azura's eighth sphere freeze. We lost anything that touches us, it's gone, there's nothing we can do about it. If we take some of the considerations I give tonight, I don't think Steiner actually leaves it completely hopeless. Certain things are lost, but we can do something about that. And that's what I want to try and end up with, is what can we do? What is the eighth sphere? Because when Steiner starts talking about the eighth sphere, he talks about it in a way where the occultists of his time in the theosophical world presented the eighth sphere and the work of Christ in such a way that we have created a false image of it. And that's part of the problem. And he spent some time trying to correct that, not a lot of time, but what he did say about it is quite profound. So that's the context, a little bit of, if we are going to try and find our relationship to the Christ in the etheric or the etheric Christ, we need to find the preconditions of how we go about that in the 21st century, because our soul world is very laden, actually, very burdened with a lot of things that we need to, in a way, refine, mature, transform even. So that's where I want to try and head tonight. So I'm just going to check out on my little list here what's next for us, because I think I've got to the first point. Yes. So, for those who are interested in where these things come from, Lisa gave a wonderful lecture last week about the creation out of nothing as a free space for the human being to find how they respond. This is not necessarily what she said, but this is partly that to the evolution and evolution, we've got this thing of the creation out of nothing, which really leads to, this is what we as human beings can do. And in that same lecture cycle, it's in its German version, it's given the title of General Anthropology, Allgemeine Menschenkunde. In English, it's called, well, in the newer translations, it's called Disease, Karma, and Healing. But there's some very wonderful lectures in there. And also the mission of Micah is the other, and then the occultism of the 19th century. So those three lecture cycles have things about the eighth sphere that we need to understand. So if you were here last week, that would have been a good help. If you were here when Ron gave his lecture last year, he talked about how the human being lives and walks upon the earth in two halves. So there's a sort of a part that's in our head, and then the other two parts are in our limbs and abdomen. And we walk within a sphere. And he was trying to ask us to consider how we understand these spheres. So he says, when you're a human being, when you live from 1 to 7, and then you go from 7 to 14, you haven't lost what you did from 1 to 7. That's still in you. You're just adding another sphere around you. It's the same when we've developed the sentient soul and we start developing the intellectual soul. We don't lose the sentient soul, we just add another sheath around it. When we develop the consciousness soul, we don't lose and no longer need the intellectual soul. It is still there and fundamental to the next stage of development. And so Steiner says, in the sense of the earth development, he draws on the blackboard, and he sort of says, we know we've got the 7 stages of evolution from Saturn through to Vulcan. So that would be Saturn, Sun, Moon. And this is the 4th phase here, where we on the earth develop the ego. It's given to us by the hierarchy that are known as the angels of form. the Elohim, the sun beings. So the form, and this is a very important part for us to understand. As we go through this, he says this, you can't do this. This is just a scheme. We actually have to draw the sun in Saturn and the moon around that and the earth around that. It's not something, we've done that and we've moved on. We're still within the spheres, these spheres. We're in the fourth sphere. And the place of the human being that's in the fourth sphere the most is our head. This part of our body is very much in the energy of the sun beings who developed a sense of I back here. So this was the Elohim's fourth sphere, 5, 6, 7. The Elohim are in the eighth sphere of their development, which we will get to over here. This will be our eighth sphere of development over there, when we become the creators of another thing, whatever we're going to call that. So he says what we need to realize is that all the time we are walking in the sphere of the Elohim, the eighth phase, he calls it at times. But he then moves in the mission of Michael from calling it the eighth sphere, or the eighth phase of development, to the eighth sphere, because we have all these spheres around us. The eighth sphere initially is the forces of the sun beings of the Elohim who have carried from the moon things across to the earth. And this is where it becomes interesting. So, over here, I might choose another calendar. Over here, the human being, I don't know if you can read the red, we get our.
No.
You can't read it?
No.
Just tell us.
The physical, is that better? And then we get the etheric added here. And over here we get the astral added. And the substances come from the higher hierarchies. Over here, the Elohim have been dreaming into our, Rufus said, it's actually the Trinity's dreaming into our creation, into our evolution. And over here, the thrones bring their substance and build the formative forces, the forms of the physical body. That's not yet material. It's not the material body that we see in front of us. This is a really critical part to this lecture. We shouldn't confuse this material body with the physical body. That's really one of the big takeaways from this. Over here, the spirits of wisdom imbue us with the etheric body, while over here, the archai, we're going through the I phase. The archai are the spirits of personality, which is also important. So the spirits of personality. Over here, we're going through the I phase. And they're known as the archai. And at that phase, before the sun phase, some of them decided they didn't want to go along with the archai. And they became the antithesis of the spirits of personality. They attack the personality of the human being. They are known as the asuras. So the asuras arose right back here when the physical body was being developed. Whereas as we come down here, the archangels went through their I phase, and they were being imbued by the spirits of wisdom from above, so below the thrones. They were building the etheric body. And that's where Ahriman split himself off, in the etheric. And as we come to the moon, the angels are going through their eye development, influenced by the spirits of movement, spirits of movement. So personality, wisdom, movement, the angels were that, and that's where Lucifer comes into play in the astral body. I know that's all very schematic, but what happens is that as we now go over into the earthly realm, the thinking substance of the spirits of movement that are in a form, they have forms, are taken by the spirits of form and made material. The whole earth existence is about the imaginative substance of the spirits of movement becoming solid. We're the material body. We're right in the middle point of this now, and we're sort of at the most material part of that. I'm not going to recapitulate all of that because there's lots and lots of again and again and again. But what's important is that the imaginations, the substance of the imaginations of the spirits of movement are taken by the spirits of form, the sun beings, and given material form, plants, animals, all the different forms we see on the earth. And what happens at that point is that Lucifer and Ahriman insinuate themselves into that. And Steiner draws another picture on here. He says, they create an eighth sphere by taking substance, so the spirits of form are giving the imaginations form, and they manage to grasp a form and create thought beings that appear as phantoms. And if we look at the earth, I'm going to draw that a little bit over here. He sort of says, if we look at the earth here, the eighth sphere is all around the earth. So this is a different eighth sphere now than what we have up to our shoulders as the energy and the formative forces of the spirits of form. The eighth sphere that Lucifer and Ahriman. So the eighth sphere of the spirits of form and the eighth sphere of the spirits of Lucifer and Ahriman are in the same place, interestingly enough. So we can't just go eighth sphere baddies. The eighth sphere is also the forces that hold the forms of the earth together in material stability. Is the word I'm looking for. So we're now needing to start to think the sort of the process of this as well as that, even though they're contradictory, are true. You need to find these contradictory images as part of this, the counterweight to this. So we have around us a sphere where Lucifer and Ahriman are constantly trying to grab the matter, that is the solidified movement substance of the spirits of movement made solid by the spirits of form. They try and grab that matter and build a world of imaginations that have a substance that we can't see, but they appear in a ghost-like spectral form where you can start to see them. And they are constantly trying to take matter into that world. And Steiner says that they would love to take a full human soul across into that world. In fact, they'd love to take us all across there. And they can. And the place that they can grasp the matter the most from out of the human being, so they can grasp into us and take matter out of us and start building this other sphere, is from our head, from our thoughts. This part below us is slightly different because that's in the eighth sphere of the spirits of form. It's protected to a point. So if we weren't protected in some form, if the spirits of form didn't create a protection of part of our being so that Lucifer and Ahriman can't fully take all the matter of our earth across to the eighth sphere, because they basically want to sever that off. That's why it's good to put it there. They want to create a world where it's severed off from what the spirits of form are wanting to do. So the spirits of form, specifically Yahweh, as one of the seven creating Elohim, holding the dream of the Trinity, made a sacrifice. Yahweh made a substance more dense than any substance on the earth, called the moon. So in here, Yahweh places the moon as a substance that Lucifer can't and Ahriman can't grab hold of because it's too hard. It's way too hard. And he did that as a sacrificial deed to protect us. So when people say the eighth sphere is behind the moon, which is what I used to say, but in rereading things, what it means is in the spiritual world behind the moon. It's not the moon itself. It's not on the back of the moon. It's all around us, much bigger than the moon sphere. That this substance is being pulled. But because Yahweh put the moon out there, I mean, this is notwithstanding that there's other functions of the moon, of course, but this is one aspect of the role of the moon in the world out there, is to temper, to put a brake, so to say, on the capacity of Lucifer and Ahriman to take these substances from our bodies, especially our heads, away from us, and so that we can actually remain creative through what the positive imaginations of the spirit of form are. Now that requires something in the human constitution as well. So in the Hermetic, as above, as in the macrocosm, so in the microcosm. Yahweh also placed something in our bodies that is the equivalent of the moon in the cosmos as a braking force or a holding of matter force that will prevent if we utilize it correctly, will slow down the process of the creation of this eighth sphere. And that is our genes, our genetics. So our hereditary, and especially the love through our hereditary, is the moon in us that counterbalances what Lucifer and Ahriman are pulling out of our head the whole time. We have to have stuff pulled out of our head, or else we wouldn't be able to think. So there's a necessity for the eighth sphere, but it's also got a very dark side to it, you could say, where it's trying to separate itself completely. But Rutan says, in our hereditary, in our genetics, and Yahweh placed into the genetics love. So the love that is poured into the genetics and the love that we can develop out of our genetics is a base point that he says that's the moon in the physical human body, in the form where Lucifer and Ahriman can't grasp matter from that. There's obviously a lot of other things that love requires in development, but that's a base point, that's a core point, that what we have in our genetics and the love that we develop through that is an essential counterbalance to the process of this phantom eighth sphere. So that's one thing we can do. We can love our family.
What?
Not always the easiest thing to do. Interestingly enough. Yeah. So when we look at this sphere and we see this effect of the eighth sphere coming to us, we would have done it in the Michaelic mission. So the one thing is this idea we have to learn, and that he gives in the materialism, or the occult movement of the 19th century, is that imagination's in the 5th lecture there. But in the opening of the mission of Michael, the first few lectures, he's talking about this eighth sphere as well, and how Lucifer and Ahriman are, trying to, they insinuate themselves into the transformation of our what Lisa was talking about. They certainly say we're given from this part of evolution. So here we're given the physical body, here we're given the etheric body, here we are given the sentient body. And as we enter into the earth realm, they have to be unconsciously transformed. The sentient body is unconsciously transformed into the sentient soul, and that's where Lucifer hops in and gets us to be passionate and desirous and all these things that take us away from what the sentient soul can be so beautiful about. As we then go further on, this is now Lemuria, going into Atlantis, so fairly recent times, the last 26,000 years or so, so the last time around the sun, so to say, around the zodiac. as we start to transform the etheric body unconsciously into the intellectual soul, Ahriman hops in there and gives us illusion and lying and deceit, all the things that we can do with our very clever minds. Now we're coming to the age of the consciousness soul, last 500 years, as we know. And as we start to unconsciously transform the physical body, the Asuras are starting to get in there. The counterbalancing of Lucifer and Ahriman in the sentient soul and the intellectual soul. Guru Shan says that the spirits of form and the wise leaders of our evolution have given us some gifts to help us overcome that. So in the sense of overcoming the effects of Lucifer in our sentient soul, we've been given suffering and illness. Suffering and illness are the gifts of the good gods to help us redeem, or, well, he does use the word redeem, but transform, at least not be completely sucked into the Ahrimanic aspect of it. Then there comes, through Lemuria and Atlantis, where we need to balance the work of Ahriman in our intellectual soul, and that is given to us, that counterbalancing to that work. If in the sentient soul it's the good gods, he says, in the intellectual soul, the karma of Ahriman is balanced by the karma of Christ. Ahriman's and Christ's karma come very close together, and the human being is given karma by the Christ being to overcome the effects of Ahriman in the intellectual soul. He then comes to the sticky point, which is in our time, as we are slowly transforming the physical forces, the physical formative forces into the consciousness soul. The Asuras will start to take pieces of our consciousness soul away. And he says that where the Asuras manage to grasp into the consciousness soul of the ego is taken out of us and kept on the earth. He says it's kept on the earth and it's lost to us forever. And that's where we stop reading, because we go, no, that's too complicated, I don't want to know about that, that's too scary. But if you read, and this is, it's really, I really appreciate what Lisa did last week, if you read a number of lectures more carefully and put the imaginations together, something else opens up. And he actually does give a path for what can be done about the effect of the Asuras in the consciousness soul. But it's tricky, because it's up to you. And we're not quite as benevolent and magnificent as the good gods and Christ yet. So it's a little bit more difficult for us to produce what's needed. He says what's needed is we need to create something in our souls, in our etheric bodies, in our astral bodies, that we can take across the threshold of death and reincorporate it as a gift into our next incarnation. That's the counterbalance to what's lost through the Asuras. I'll go more into that, what happens in a moment. So when you hear Asuras, don't panic. Do some spiritual work. But it's not that hard. The spiritual work's not hard, as we will see. But when Rudasthana then talks about it, he says, so we've got the one aspect, which is the love in our genetics. I want to come back to the moon, so I'm just going to write that on the board so I don't forget. I'm going to come back to the moon. If I do forget to come back to the moon, please remind me, because it's more important. But what Rudasthana says is we need to start Michaelic thinking rather than Ahrimanic thinking in our times to counterbalance this work in the 8th sphere. And the Michaelic thinking goes something like this. He says we all know that they're angels. And we all know that they work, but they're invisible, and the work is invisible. And we're quite happy to think of the 9 hierarchies and the Trinity and Lucifer and Ahriman and all this invisible work. But then we come to our fellow human beings, and we think that the person in front of us is visible. And so he's in the room like this, and he says, please none of you are in this room. These are just the atoms that your spirit has managed to put together like this. Some of it's nice and some of it's not so nice. But this is not really the human being. He says we need to not only think this, we need to develop a feeling, seeing, that when we look at a person, that the physical material has the real being working in the invisible. And we need to come to think like that. And I've been sort of trying that out the last few weeks. It's not always easy. But we need to start having that as a way of life, that when amongst people, that we start to have this feeling perception that the real formative forces and the real entity of the person is the thing that pulls the atoms together in this form. That's the counterbalance to the eighth sphere, the materialistic, because the attack of the Asuras, he says, he gives an example of where the attack will come. The one is to think that we just evolved out of the animals, that we're just a clever animal, and catch yourself on that. It's almost impossible not to think like that these days because of the kind of collective consciousness that we're given. We really have to work at the evolutionary principles of anthroposophy to counterbalance this thing that we're just a highly evolved animal. I just read another, Neil deGrasse, for example, goes down this track. There are a whole lot of people who really just push this thing that every human faculty is just produced by biochemistry. All these things that we do, that's where parts of our consciousness soul will be eaten out, and we can't reclaim them. And then obviously the other one that he brings up is the sexual depravity that is going on in the world, and it will get worse. And we're living here in Australia at the moment where that's reached a fever pitch. Fortunately, I don't know whether it will change anything, but at least there's a collective saying this has to stop. And anyway, we won't go into all that, but there's a huge amount of stuff that's got worse and worse around that is also as a resultant of just seeing ourselves as an animal, except that in the human being it's not animal-like anymore. It's not even bestial, it's depraved. So we can't say that kind of thing is an animal in us. It's an out-of-control passion that has anti-human imagination to it. And these are all symptoms and hotspots that are appearing in the news. They're not even the tip of the iceberg. They're like the earthquake before the volcano in Michaelic is what it is. Because Ruditas says, if you really want to feel where Ahriman is announcing his work, it'll be in the earthquakes and the volcanoes and the storms and the things that are happening. That's the climate change, that Ahriman is raising his battle cry. And we're responsible for that because we're not doing these works. So to try and get this sense of understanding the human being as the invisible spirits at work in the world, because once we do that, we can take the next step, which is the point of this lecture, is that we can then find the Christ in the spiritual world. We cannot find the Christ walking amongst us. I know all those sort of things, we've got to see the Christ in the other being. But that's part of that invisible being. The true self in each being is what we need to see. And if we don't practice perceiving the invisible human and the work of the invisible human in the world of form, we won't get to meet the Christ in the etheric. So there's ways to prepare that. I mean, I've often said that here. Rittelmeyer, who was one of the founding priests of the Christian community, he asked Rudolf Steiner, how can a Damascus-like experience, in other words, a perception of the etheric Christ be prepared today? And he said, live with the meditative cycle of the year. So live with the year in a meditative way. And there's many ways to do that. But by living with the rhythms of the cosmos, we school the spiritual senses to begin to perceive in these ways. But I wanted tonight to bring these other ways that he's talking about. So we've touched on two now. The one is about what we said at the beginning, which is really forgotten. And the second one is, so I don't blame you if you've forgotten what I said. The second one, the love in the genetics, yes, thank you. And the second one now is very much to do with being able to see the human hierarchy as an invisible, they work out of the invisible. So we're ready to start seeing the human hierarchy the same way we see the angels and the Trinity and all those beings. So is a second counter force to that. So when we now come to sort of two more critical things. I'll just go through these here. I think I'm getting close to what I want you to say. How are we doing on the time? Anyone got the time? 22. Oh, good. So we've got those two things. So the next level of work that we can do is how do we really establish this relationship to I might leave that to last actually. I'm going to go back to the moon for a moment. Is if we see this development of the moon is a sacrificial deed of Yahweh. In other words, if you look at how the seven creator spirits of the Elohim carry the dreaming into the formation of these seven spheres or seven stages of development, he says you have to imagine these seven beings as seven independent beings who love each other so deeply they become one entity. And so we have, interpreting, say, scripture, and we hear Elohim. We experience the monotheism side of it. There's also a complexity that's working through there. And Yahweh actually steps outside of that. He's still part of that, but he separates himself from that and establishes the moon as and then the basis for the brain, but also the basis for the hereditary. But in this moon, we have something really, really important, because it is, and this is, I might just read this to you because it's led me to ponder this, and partly Yahweh must be regarded as that being who even in the physical domain has ensured that not all materiality can be drawn away by Lucifer and Ahriman. And then, at the right time, equal care will be taken by the same Spirit that the moon shall re-enter the earth when the earth is strong enough to receive it, when the danger is averted by the development that has meanwhile taken place. We've got three things there. Yahweh is still very interested in how the moon works for us. When the work that has been done to avert the danger has been done, so that the moon can come back in as a substance. But how will that substance be when it comes back in? This is really my question. And we can see that working with the moon has always inspired humanity. Working with the phases of the moon, the woman in the moon, the man in the moon, law versus law, L-A-W versus L-O-R-E. There's a feminine aspect to the moon and there's a masculine aspect to the moon, culturally speaking. The phases of the moon, the rhythms of the moon, all these different things. But we also can work, and this is a suggestion, how would we work spiritually, scientifically with the substance of the moon to prepare it with Yahweh so that it can be reintegrated into the earth? And I think, out of my work with this, is that when Steiner says living meditatively with the cycle of the year means that we've got rhythms between the earth, the 28 days of the moon, and then the cycle of the apparent movement through the 12 houses of the zodiac. In these rhythms, we inscribe things into it. And this is, if you read my book, that's my sort of main argument, is that in the past, we turn to the cosmos to be nourished by our cultural, spiritual, religious life. If we're going to take spiritual science seriously, we have to put things into the cosmos. I mean, that lecture cycle just before the Goetheanum burns down, we have to rename the stars. We have to see the cherubim in the zodiac and give them new content. So the question would be is, can we work with the rhythm from new moon to full moon each month, where at new moon a seed idea emerges in us, and then Osiris, who went to the moon with Yahweh, so Osiris and Isis work with Yahweh on the moon. Osiris works with the waxing moon for 14 days and brings that idea to fruition at the full moon. And then Isis takes over and works with the waning moon for 14 days and comes back to a new seed moment. Is it possible that part of our cycle of the year is not just to work with the sun and the zodiac, but also in imbuing imaginations, full imaginations, into the substance of the moon to prepare it in such a way that when it comes back and joins us, it's not just slack, it's not just overly hard substance. So can we find a way in working with it? It goes way beyond what I want to say tonight, but it's a huge area of consideration, is that we can, either through the religious cycle of the year with the calendar of the soul, the 12 moods, whatever it is that we work with, but also to try and mark these moments. So for example, right now we are in the world where, as the sun is spiraling forwards through our galaxy, and the Earth and the other planets are also being dragged by it and rotating through each other in these lemniscatory forms, we've come to the point where the sun has moved out of this line of process, and the Earth is now right in the center point of the equinox. And we're just about at a full moon, the first full moon of this year, which started on the 2 days ago. The solar year starts on the 21st of March. And we've seeded that 2 weeks ago, and there's going to be a full moon. And as we move to the first Sunday after the full moon, there's a really important energy for the first festival of the year in April. And then in May we have the Wesak festival. In June we have the festival of the Holy Spirit. But in April, the resurrection of the Christ being is really important. To feel that and to work with the rhythms of the moon and the sun. And guess what? There's a huge push, because it's way too inconvenient, to put Easter on the first Sunday of April each year. There's a huge push to just materialize it, because then we can plan our calendar and business and all those things, and we don't have to think when we might have to do school holidays, and we can just go tick, 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 and, and this is why the spiritual worlds have created these rhythms of the moon that Lucifer and Ariman can't get hold of. They can get hold of our ideas and make us use those rhythms differently. Or we can just refuse to do that and just go, no, we're not going to do that. So that's a little bit of the moon. And then the last thing I wanted to say was a little bit on the work with the Azuras, because that is the one that I think Rutan says we shouldn't talk about them too much because it does generate fear. But I want to try and put a positive ending to this, where we feel a bit able to say, with the changes that are happening in the world since 1879, with all these things that have really changed for us constitutionally, but also in the ether and in the hierarchies, where these more negative forces are becoming more powerful. We need to find positive things we can do. A bit like what Lisa was saying, what's the creative decision I can make in my freedom right now? Because that's a new creation. That's part of what we can do. We can find this capacity. So all these things I'm talking about, I think, are things we can take up aspects of that in our day-to-day life. I mean, you can do that. But the one that's really interesting is a little bit about, again, in that lecture cycle, the 107, there is a lecture that was brought out in this form many years ago, The Deed of Christ, and it's called The deed of Christ and the opposing spiritual powers, Lucifer, Ahriman, Mephistopheles, and the Asuras. And you go, yes, okay. But as he goes through this, he describes what I put here that comes very much from this lecture. But at the end, where he's described the Asuras, he kind of asks this question. He says, fragment after fragment will be torn out of the eye, and in the same measure in which the Asuric spirits establish themselves in the consciousness soul, the human being must leave part of their existence behind of the earth. What thus has become prey of the Asuric powers will be irretrievably lost. And I sort of said, well, we were given something by the good gods, we were given something by Christ. And then he goes on for the rest of the lecture, which is half the lecture, about what we can do as human beings. He doesn't say, this is the countermeasure to that. But he says, what we need to do is we need to redeem Lucifer first. So there's a 4-step program, not a 12-step program. There's a 4-step program at the end of this lecture. And I'm going to just briefly run you through these 4 steps of what we can do. Step 1. Christ appeared, and with him the force which can bear the human being upwards again into the spiritual world. But if we so will, the human being can come to know Christ and can gather all wisdom to this end. So that's the first step, the will to know Christ and gather all wisdom to that end. What do we achieve thereby? Something of untold importance. When a person knows Christ, when they absorb the wisdom which begets insight, and we could say that's a Sophianic being side to it. These goes there in other lectures. When the human being absorbs the wisdom which begets insight into what Christ truly is, you redeem yourself and the Luciferic beings through the knowledge of Christ. Step 2 is that the Luciferic being that's redeemed becomes the Holy Spirit. I'll just say that again. The redeemed Lucifer and the Luciferic beings becomes the Holy Spirit. So Lucifer becomes the light bearer who then unites with Christ and carries the light being of Christ into the beings that are the wisdom masters who are inspiring humanity at this point. So Lucifer and Christ have to unite, but Lucifer and Christ cannot unite if the human being doesn't redeem Lucifer first. So Lucifer is bound in a certain sense, and our work, this is why it's a simple task, but nearly impossible to do. One of those things we would have done and sets up for us quite a bit, is to find, how do we find this wisdom of the Christ being, so that in releasing that wisdom into us, the Luciferic being is transformed into the Holy Spirit, and the second step is that Luciferic, that Holy Spirit being unites with the Christ and brings the light into the inspiring beings of humanity, who then can inspire us more. Third step, because they can have these light beings. To cultivate spiritual science means to understand that the Spirit has been sent into the world by Christ. The pursuit of spiritual science is implicit in true Christianity. And the 4th step is then, we can, as a consequence of those who fill the world with light, make progress in our moral life and in our life of will and in the intellectual life. So we will bear with us into the supersensible life the fruits acquired in this physical life, and ever again bring these fruits back from the supersensible life into a new incarnation. So let's go through that again. We stand very incomplete at the moment. We have beings who are trying to push us out of our humanity in the sentient soul through passions, in the intellectual soul through lies and deception, in the consciousness soul by actually hollowing us out. It'd be very interesting to listen to the world where people are feeling hollowed out at the moment. Really hollowed out. They're almost using that language. But to change that, we can pay attention through the ways I've spoken. We can also pay attention to finding the wisdom of the Christ within us and thereby releasing Lucifer from this bind and becomes the Holy Spirit who unites, who becomes the Luciferos, the light bearer, who unites with the light, who inspires the masters of wisdom and harmony, who then allow us, inspire us to work. It's a bit of a kind of a circuit, to transform. And I ended my last lecture at this point as well, 6 months ago, when we transform through faith, and we transform through love, and we transform through consciousness, and we build the bodies of the Christ within us. And by building these bodies of the Christ within us, that's what we carry as this last step across the threshold and can reincorporate as a new part of our next incarnation as the countermeasure to what the Azuras are doing at the moment. Simple, really. In theory. Hard work though, but it's not hopeless. And I think that's, it's like he actually says that when we're talking about these beings, we must remember that evil is only here for a time. It's here to challenge us, it's here to strengthen us, but ultimately we will transform it, and then we will move on to fighting the next bad guys. Star Wars. And that is the end of my lecture. Thank you very much.